When I was a kid, I remember not paying attention in class, getting out of my seat a lot, and having these enormous emotional meltdowns that usually resulted in me being sent to the principal's office to calm down. I've always been an emotional person, but I didn't realize that big emotions were part of ADHD. But we've actually known that emotional dysregulation is connected to ADHD for a long time. We just weren't sure exactly why. New research suggests that ADHD isn't just an executive dysfunction disorder, it also affects our emotions, and not for the reasons we once thought. That's what I'm talking about today. What's going on in our ADHD brains that makes us so emotional? I'm Patty, the girl with blue energy. I have ADHD and bipolar disorder, and I make videos about mental health and personal growth. So what is emotional dysregulation, and what does it have to do with ADHD? Emotional dysregulation basically means we struggle with controlling and managing our emotions. Over the years, researchers have noticed that ADHD kids have bigger emotions and problems with regulating them. This can mean that they have stronger emotions, faster emotional reactions, or a harder time controlling their emotions. This can look like emotional meltdowns, getting frustrated more easily, having a shorter fuse, being more emotionally reactive, or being overly sensitive. We have known that kids with ADHD had issues with managing their emotions, but our understanding of why was primarily focused on the executive functioning aspect of the disorder. So we thought about emotion regulation through the lens of executive dysfunction. So emotional impulsivity was caused by the same issues that caused us to have impulsive behaviors, or difficulty managing emotions was caused by the same issues that made it hard or difficult for us to start tasks. Many of our theories about why our ADHD brains struggle with emotional dysregulation were built around the idea that our emotional issues were caused by executive dysfunction, instead of seeing that emotional dysregulation might be part of the disorder itself. One of the leading theories about why ADHD kids struggle with their emotions has been around for the last couple decades. It basically says that parts of our brain are developmentally behind our peers. This implies that we are emotionally immature and that we'll catch up with our peers over time. I'm going to talk about these ideas first, where they came from, and how they've shaped the discussion on emotional dysregulation in ADHD. So let's talk about some of the older theories about ADHD and emotional dysregulation. We know that there's an emotional component to ADHD. Kids with ADHD are often more emotionally reactive, and many of them struggle with issues like rejection sensitivity dysphoria. These are a few of the older theories that we believed explain this. The first explanation is that we have impaired executive functioning. So we know that ADHD involves impaired executive functioning. Executive functioning is basically the manager of our brain. It helps us to concentrate, set goals, and get things done. We thought that impaired executive functioning also affected how we manage our emotions. Most people don't think of executive dysfunction as emotional dysfunction. But if the part of your brain that interprets and manages emotional input is impaired, it would naturally affect how you process and respond to emotions. So this is what researchers believed was causing the emotional impulsivity, sensitivity, and reactivity in ADHD brains. Our brains had deficits in processing emotional information and regulating it for the same reasons we struggle with regulating our impulses. Another explanation involves two regions of the brain that help process and regulate emotions. Researchers believe the amygdala and prefrontal cortex may function differently in people with ADHD. The amygdala is involved in processing emotions, while the prefrontal cortex helps you to interpret those emotions and decide how to respond to them. Researchers think the amygdala may be smaller and more reactive in ADHD brains. So, if the part of the brain that processes emotions is more reactive, and the part that's responsible for interpreting and regulating those emotions is also not working right, this might help explain why some people with ADHD struggle with managing or controlling their emotional reactions. DESR, deficient emotional self-regulation. DESR is a newer term introduced by Dr. Russell Barkley. He's an ADHD expert that's been involved in many of today's theories and discussions about emotional dysregulation in ADHD. DESR is used to describe the issues people with ADHD have with managing emotions and self-regulation. It reflects the idea that emotional self-regulation may be another area of impairment or deficit in ADHD. But it specifically defines emotional dysregulation in ADHD as a top-down self-regulation issue, meaning that emotional regulation issues stem from cognitive or processing issues in the prefrontal cortex. So people with ADHD may not be experiencing stronger emotions like you tend to see in mood disorders. Instead, they have difficulty managing, controlling, or recovering from those emotions because of deficits in executive function. This term helps differentiate the type of emotional dysregulation you see in ADHD versus mood disorders or other mental health conditions. These are a few examples of the kind of emotional self-regulation issues that people with ADHD might struggle with. Not being able to control emotional reactions. Having a hard time self-soothing or calming down. Not being able to regroup after experiencing a difficult emotion. These are just some of the self-regulation emotional issues that people with ADHD can have. Now let's talk about one of the biggest theories we've had about what causes emotional dysregulation in ADHD. The delayed brain maturation theory. We didn't just believe that ADHD kids had issues with how their prefrontal cortex functions. For the last couple decades, we also thought that their brains were a little behind their peers. This idea came from a landmark 2007 study on ADHD brain development. Results from the study led researchers to believe that ADHD brains were 2 to 3 years behind in maturation. The study looked at MRI brain scans of 223 children with ADHD and 223 neurotypical children. It used cortical thickness measurements to track how the kids' brains developed over time. Cortical thickness is one way researchers use to measure brain maturation. What they noticed was that both groups' brains developed in the same way, but the ADHD kids' brains were a few years behind when they reached peak cortical thickness. This is what led them to believe that their brain development was delayed. The 30% rule was another idea coined by Dr. Russell Barkley that came from this study. It basically said that ADHD kids were 30% behind in executive functioning compared to other kids. He used this 30% as a rule of thumb to help parents understand how far behind their kids were in executive functioning and self-regulation. So if a child was 10, they might have the executive functioning age of a 7-year-old, or if they were 30, they might be more like 21. Many of the theories on ADHD emotional dysregulation were largely based on conclusions drawn from this study. So for 20 years now, we've been saying that ADHD brains are developmentally behind and less mature. But new research may be causing us to completely rethink why ADHD and emotional dysregulation are connected. That's what I'm going to talk about next. There have been a few new studies that may change the way we look at ADHD. The first study, published in the journal Translational Psychiatry in November 2025, identified 3 different subtypes of ADHD based on abnormal cortical thickness. The subtypes were underdeveloped, overdeveloped, and mixed. A more recent study published in February 2026 looked at the brain scans of ADHD kids, but they did something different. Unlike previous studies, they took a brain-first approach to looking at the brain scans. So instead of looking at the symptoms and then looking for patterns in the brain scans, they looked at the brain scans first. The study involved 1,154 children. 446 had ADHD, and the others were controls. After analyzing all of the brain scans, they grouped together the children whose brain scans looked similar. Once they had these similarities mapped out, they looked at the symptoms of the ADHD kids, and they found something interesting. The researchers found 3 separate ADHD types: predominantly hyperactive impulsive ADHD, predominantly inattentive ADHD, and a more severe type they called severe combined ADHD with emotional dysregulation. The most severe type had the most brain abnormalities of the 3 groups, but they also had the most severe symptoms. The brain scans of the kids with the most emotional dysregulation showed widespread disruption involving the medial prefrontal cortex and pallidum. These regions are involved in motivation, emotional regulation, and impulse control. This study found evidence that emotional dysregulation is part of ADHD and may be linked to more severe ADHD symptoms. A third study published in PNAS in May 2026 discovered something else that may change how we think about ADHD and emotional dysregulation. This study attempted to replicate the 2007 study I discussed earlier, where scientists discovered that ADHD kids had a delay in cortical thickness. They used a larger data source to confirm the findings. At first, their results seemed to match the original study, but then they decided to check these findings by filtering for different factors. The study's author noticed that studies using this same data source found different patterns of cortical thickness in boys and girls. So they compared the brains of ADHD boys separately from the ADHD girls. And when they did this, they discovered that the original study didn't account for differences between males and females. When this was taken into account, the study concluded that there was no difference in ADHD brain maturity as previously thought. This study was just recently published this month, so that's why I wanted to talk about it, because this totally reframes the conversation that we're having about what causes emotional dysregulation in ADHD. And I'm going to add the links to all the studies I've talked about in this video in the description so you can read them for yourself. Is emotional dysregulation actually a core feature of ADHD? We currently define ADHD based on symptoms like inattention, distractibility, and hyperactivity. And we currently recognize 3 types of ADHD: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and a combined type. These subtypes seem to align with the most recent research, but even with the data that presents a more severe type with emotional dysregulation, we still don't have a diagnosis that includes emotional dysregulation as part of the disorder. Maybe this research will move us in that direction. So what does this research mean for ADHD? Well, we've known for a long time that emotional dysregulation is common in ADHD. Researchers have debated whether or not it's part of ADHD itself or a result of comorbid conditions like depression, anxiety, and mood disorders. But we have been describing it as a supporting feature of ADHD. This new research seems to demonstrate that emotional dysregulation is in fact a major symptom of ADHD for some, but it also explains why ADHD presents so differently in people. Maybe the emotional dysregulation we see isn't explained by comorbid conditions or a lag in brain development, but instead a result of how our brains actually function. This study also suggests that ADHD may be way more complex and involve more areas of the brain than we once thought. Understanding these differences could lead to more personalized approaches to diagnosis and treatment. I tried to make this video informative. If you liked it, please support my channel by clicking the like button and, of course, subscribe. I'll have another video out real soon.